Yes.
Okay. So welcome everyone to this lecture that is being delivered by a life member of CWDS and a very old friend of mine. My colleague Seema Kazi isn't feeling so well, so she usually handles the seminar series. So she asked me to step in and I'm only too glad to do so. Janaki taught modern history at the Center for Historical Studies, JNU, until she retired in 2020. Her research and teaching interests include labor, legal, and urban history, focused largely on the princely state of Mysore and the Karnataka region. Her publications include Mysore Modern, Rethinking the Region Under Princely Rule, The Promise of the Metropolis, Bangalore's 20th Century, Miners and Mill Hands, Work Culture and Politics in Princely Mysore. And today, we're going to hear about Between Crime and Politics, Women and Children in Mysore's 1942. Over to you, Janaki.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this occasion, and I'm particularly pleased that I will be seeing this as something of a send-off to your time at CWDS. So thank you for inviting me to the series. It has actually encouraged me to go back to something I wrote a while ago. I wrote it actually in 2007. And it has a version of it has been published in a book which I think very few people have seen, called Enculturing the Law. So I have had reason to go back to that material and perhaps to reorder some of that material to make it more appropriate for an occasion like this. But let me first, so I'm going to actually read bits and then also talk a few bits, and I'm reading from the screen, so I hope I can just minimize the Zoom talk right now. Let me start by saying that these are very difficult times in which to be a professional historian, because we are enjoined today to express our nationalist fervor by celebrating those who participated in India's freedom struggle. And of course, this particular event is part of that series. And we are enjoined, moreover, to assert our Indianness by being nationalists. And these two have become inseparable. And finally, we are urged to highlight only those aspects of our past that reflect its glories. But I cannot tell you how far away this is from what the historians have been doing over the last 40 years. They have moved away from, or I should say, we have moved away from an understanding of Indian history as the tale of endless glory. I don't think it ever was that, but at least that's how we are being told it should be. Looking instead to include regions, languages, castes, ethnicities and genders which had largely been ignored or marginalized in the national narrative. Now, this is not an inclusion which comes easy. It necessarily means ways of thinking about social structures, economic processes, as well as both the solidarities and cleavages that they engendered. For instance, the work of many Indian historians on the meaning of freedom to the wide range of groups that participated in anti-colonial struggles, and the meaning they made of the call to embrace Swadeshi, to demand Swaraj, to participate in nonviolent struggle, all of this has revealed a very fascinating and far more complex picture than the simple textbook tale of heroism. Let's take the last great popular upsurge before independence, the Quit India movement of 1942. No doubt M.K. Gandhi was its unquestionable leader, but since the 1920s at least, the movement in different parts of the country, as we now well know, went far beyond his call for peaceful, nonviolent protests, and in fact might even have turned against that message. We also know, as a result of this, nearly 4 decades of new research, that there were those who remained indifferent to his call, or even collaborated with British war effort. So clearly, what I'm suggesting right at the outset is that we have to come to terms with many histories in order to grasp not only the genius of Gandhi, but the ways in which he was translated and adapted to regional contexts, concerns, and relations. I am going to, through an act of producing a micro history, unravel the lineaments of the 1942 movement in a village in Mysore, the princely state of the south, where I have to say as well, right at the outset, that the Congress had a relatively weaker presence. Mysore, in fact, was little known even to the people of Mysore, Karnataka, that is to say, in the post-independence period. They say that when Virendra Patil wanted to establish a memorial at Mysore, the journalists had to go scrambling to find out where it was and what it signified. That was in 1971, and things have not changed too much since then. Although it was, as I'm going to now recount, the seat of a very paradoxical development, since an act of popular violence, which led to death, was met with a ferocious state response. So I would say what has become unspeakable in most narratives of issues 1942 is the violence in which the people of this village, which declared independence for just 3 days, participated before they had in turn to face the violence of the state. Now, Gyan Pandey has brought together a set of essays in a 1988 volume called The Indian Nation in 1942. And it's interesting that it had no place for the upsurge that took place in Mysore, Karnataka, and I'm sure many other regions as well, given the time when it was produced. But there have been several other attempts at framing Mysore as an important event in the making of modern Mysore. There have been, for example, semi-fictionalized accounts of the struggles of the people of Mysore, the recorded memoirs and memories of those who participated in the struggle, an account of Quit India in Mysore alone, and of the Mysore struggle by professional historians. There have been Congress reports and a very touching and detailed personal memoir by C. Lingappa. And now, I was trying to establish whether this film has in fact been produced, but in 2015, Shivraj Kumar was planning to bring out a film called Mysore Dange, and I could not find out or establish whether in fact that film was made. All these...
Now, if you speak, then
I'm sorry?
Giving her yes.
All these accounts...
Mute me now.
Sorry, Janaki. Yeah, it's fine.
All these accounts, which I have sort of listed above, insist on the broad consensus that was achieved during the Quit India movement and are largely unquestioning of the nationalist narrative, which sees the death sentence of 5 Mysore peasants as a lasting reminder of the brutalities of colonial rule. As a result, the moment of popular violence that led to the death of the Amaldar and the sub-inspector, which actually triggered the brutality of the state apparatuses, is striking for the brevity of its treatment. In fact, the tendency is to gloss over that particular moment because, of course, the repercussions were very much more serious and in some ways remembered for much longer. So what is unspeakable about this act of violence, apart from its shocking departure from anything that Gandhi might have stood for? The event, I argue, must be seen as an illuminating flash which brought a relatively little-known village to brief renown, and in the process highlights many of the disjunctions in a seamless narrative of Gandhian nationalism. And this is not something new that I'm saying. This is what historians for different parts of the country, different regions and languages have been establishing for some time now. Let us just recall Gandhi's words on the eve of his arrest at 5 a.m. on August 9th, 1942. And he said, everyone is free to go to the fullest extent under ahimsa. Complete deadlock by strikes and other non-violent means. It is only when individuals go out to die that the nation will survive. And then he made the famous statement, karenge ya marenge, we shall do or die. How did this call to do or die get faithfully interpreted as killing on behalf of the nation, so that the walls of the Veerabhadra Swami temple at Isur, the center of the Isur struggle, included the slogan, and I'm now quoting, "Let there be unity. Let the government servants be cut to pieces. Riot brethren, be united. Give up communal differences." Now you can see there's a jumble of kind of exhortations there, but certainly one of them is to attack government servants. Gyanendra Pandey has pointed out that in northern India, the Hindi karo ya maro was all too easily corrupted into karo ya maro to enable the series of violent incidents and guerrilla actions that formed the staple of the Quit India movement nationwide. We all know this. It was perhaps the most violent popular upsurge. In addition to pointing to the more complicated relationship between an official leadership and the popular radical movement within the nationalist struggle than has been widely acknowledged, an interrogation of the people's violence and the nature of peasant participation will disrupt the narrative unquestioning unity attributed to the Isur struggle of 1942. If on the one hand, the nationalist narrative has largely highlighted the violence of the law, or more properly, the law's violence, what, following Ranajit Guha, Upendra Bakshi and others, was the law of violence that was revealed by this incident? How, furthermore, in the light of detailed studies that are now available of the parallel governments of Satara Prati Sarkar in Western India, Tamluk Jatiya Sarkar in Bengal, and Talcher state, the messianic quality of Lakshman Naiko's revolt in Orissa, there are all these very detailed micro studies. May we understand this short-lived 3-day parallel government in Isur run by 2 young boys. Finally, we may investigate the event as much for what has been left unsaid about its promises, its threats, and its disturbing betrayals as a way of giving voice to those who were condemned to silence, particularly the women participants. Now, I must say here that the principal archive, as it were, which has allowed me to look at this incident and the dense network of alliances, cleavages, and solidarities in this village has been the judicial archive. And of course, we are only too aware as historians that we are not performing the act of the judge, but nevertheless, we are using this judicial archive, which is extremely detailed in terms of the kinds of material it offers us, the kinds of insights it offers us into relationships within this small village. Having said that, let me say that when I visited Isur in, I think it was 2006, I saw that there was a very interesting recuperation of this event in the memorial tablets, which were installed in 1995 at this considerably expanded Sri Veerabhadra Swami temple, which was the fulcrum, as I've said, of the struggle itself. A black polished granite slab lists all the names of the men who went to the gallows, so the 5 men who went to the gallows, and those who suffered life imprisonment and rigorous imprisonment of various terms. But the most interesting inclusions in this list are 2 other sets of people. Pranarpisida Adhikarigalu, that is, people who had given their lives in service, namely Chankrishnappa, who was a Tehsildar, and Kenchegoda, who was a sub-inspector, the 2 murdered officials of the state. And then you have an even more surprising inclusion, which is the Bhugata Karyakartaru, namely those who had actually gone underground, two saukars or landlords, as we shall see, Sahukar Baswanappa and Angri Halappa, who absconded, evaded arrest, and later died in relative obscurity. Here then is an act of recovery by the representatives of the independent nation state, one that wishes to present a new unity to the citizenry of Isur. It is one which would find the virulent hostility of the peasant to the state's apparatuses too dangerous to foster even as a memory, so that the hallowed precincts of the temple confer a post-independence citizenship, as it were, on all its Indian heroes, even when they were the emissaries of the colonial state. So, as I've said before, just a moment ago, I have relied to a great extent on the richness of the judicial archive. Let me just preface my plunging into the specific incident by just giving you a bit of a background to 1942 in a state like Mysore. It was a movement which was largely powered by students. And so, of course, the young were a very major part of this movement, workers and women who participated in very large numbers, especially following the immediate arrest of the top leadership. So this again is something that we know from studies elsewhere as well. It involved the cutting of telegraph wires, the boycott and closure of schools and colleges, the shutting down of industries, ticketless travel, breaking of other kinds of forms of communication, and so on. And in some ways, at least in Isur, which is in the Shimoga district, and in particular in the Shikaripur taluk, which incidentally is the taluk from which our former Chief Minister Yediyurappa comes, it is a region which is adjoining the Bombay presidency. I'm sorry, I don't have a map to illustrate this for you, but it is adjoining the Bombay presidency, where there was a very, very active no tax movement in the 1930-1934 period, in which large numbers of Congress people, including women, were involved. And so there's a long history of non-cooperation in this area of what we would call Bombay Karnataka, and spilling over into some parts of Shimoga as well. But what about Isur? Isur was a large and prosperous multi-caste village in Shikaripur taluk with about 400 to 500 houses and a population of more than 2,000. Shikaripur taluk was studded with tanks and kattes, and generally had long earthen bunds separating lush fields of paddy, and especially after the establishment of an irrigation project called the Anjanapur project, sugarcane as well. In other words, it was a very, very prosperous village, a village which was dominated by Lingayats. Isur was also a prominent weaving center, at least until the devastating fire of March 1928, when nearly 200 houses belonging to the weaver community were destroyed. But there were at least 35 very wealthy Lingayat landowning families who engaged in money lending as well, and were referred to as sahukars. But by the 1940s, it is clear that there were several Lingayat families who were also working as agricultural laborers. Many of the Lingayats testified before the court that they paid between 1,500 and 2,000 per annum as assessment, and also as income tax. At the other end of the social scale were the 50-odd Adi Karnataka and Wadar families, and there were many intermediary castes who made up the middle, as it were, the Kumbharas, the Darjis, the Vishwakarmas, most of whom combined work on small plots of land with their professions, artisanal professions. And there were finally a small number of Muslim families in the village, some of whom, like Sattar Muhammad Dastagir, doubled as the schoolmaster along with his sons, leasing in and cultivating the lands of a Lingayat leader, Guru Shantappa. And there were others like Paurya Sahib and Pir Khan and so on, who worked as laborers under Guru Shantappa for wages. So there was a very interesting mix of people who owned land, leased land, and then also worked for wages. The Lingaites, as you can already imagine, enjoyed a measure of social and political dominance as a consequence of the landholding structure and their function as local elites, and also, importantly, their patronage of poorer members of the caste and their support for activities of the mathas and the temples. This generosity was also extended to the patronage of the Congress. Furthermore, there is evidence of very fierce contests over the post of Patel. Lingayat factions in Mysore, in fact, were actually reflected in these very spatial terms. There was thus a Patel Street and there was a Saukar Street. And there was, of course, some degree of ill will between the Patels and the Saukars. But the ill will between the various branches of the Lingayat families also in some ways affected the membership of the Congress itself. And as I've said, there were at least two identifiable factions at Mysore, one led by Basvanappa and his brother Achali Rudrappa, while the Sadra Lingayats, so this is the Sadra Lingayats, this is another sort of Lingayat sect, was led by Dodshivappa, and then there were these mathas they respectively belonged to, between which there was also dissension. Now, the Congress had a presence in nearby Shikaripur and, of course, in Shimoga town, but Mysore itself was a relatively inaccessible and somewhat, it was somewhat slower to receive and respond to the message of nationalism, even in 1942. Of course, in 1930-31 civil disobedience movement, Shikarpur area was among one of those that actually had defied the revenue authorities. And in some villages, the less than 10% of the revenue demand was met, clearly indicating that there was withholding of revenue, which called for the adoption of very effective coercive measures until such revenue arrears were recovered. And it was noted at that time, because of the difficulty in actually corralling this revenue together from this region in the time of civil disobedience, that the riots of this area were carrying on the same tactics that were known in bordering Bombay, Karnataka. So they were seen as somehow being influenced by these modes of mobilization and also modes of social boycott and excommunication, which were exerting a certain kind of pressure on them to conform to this kind of resistance. It was also, however, recognized that there was a fall in the price of agricultural commodities and there was a failure of rains, which had led people of the area to demand a remission of revenue. So there were certain economic reasons for people actually wanting to take that political step. But in 1942, the revenue collections just before the period of August 1942, the collections from this region were quite satisfactory. But nevertheless, the Bombay Karnataka activists had put pressure on landlords such as Basvanappa and Angadi Halappa to stop the revenue payments and had also urged Sahukar Basvanappa to organize a parallel government. Now, this is where really our story begins, because this government itself was run by a young surrogate for Sahukar Basvanappa, who was the 10-year-old Jayappa, the grandson of his brother Sahukar Rudrappa. This boy was assisted by a 12-year-old member of the Sahukar family, K.G. Mallappa, who took on the role of sub-inspector. The parallel government ran only for 3 days. And here I must say that, I was in the Sagar, Mysore area sometime in 2006. I had the good fortune of meeting Professor Ananthamurthy. And when I told him this, about this parallel government, which ran for 3 days, he said, but imagine if you had died before those 3 days had ended, you would have thought that you had, already won freedom for India. So that's one way to think about it. This parallel government ran for 3 days, in which time it organized Prabhat ferries and inflicted punishments on the visiting Patel and Shanbog for refusing to resign their posts and for entering what was described as a liberated area. The government came to an abrupt end with the death of Kenchegowda and Chenkrashnappa at the hands of an Mysore crowd, which in turn led to the brutality against the people of Mysore. But there are a few questions that might be raised about an event that has, since R.R. Divakar's first report, R.R. Divakar being from Bombay, Karnataka, stuck close to the script of the nationalist reading of the events at Mysore. And I'm not here going to discuss, as I said, the guerrilla actions, such as the damaging of the culverts and the bridges, the cutting of wires and trees, and so on and so forth. But I will focus only on the events at Mysore and the kinds of questions it allows us to ask about the nature of local power and the transformations that were enabled by a movement such as the Quit India movement. So the first question that I would like to raise here is the question concerning the surrogacy of this government, with young boys taking power, as they say, in the name of their landlord, moneylender elites of the village. While it is true that students were among the most active constituents of the Quit India movement throughout India, none of the parallel governments elsewhere appear to have made their power over to surrogates in this manner. Was this a sign of a totally different definition of childhood among the landed classes, who had to assume their political social duties as miniature adults? Or were the children, as the judge Darcy Riley put it, merely play acting? We know from the Balaka ashrams that were organized by the Congress itself in the Shimoga and Karwar towns during the 1930-34 period that childhood was recognized and afforded a certain protection by the Congress. So it's not as if there is this blurring of this stage in the life cycle to which we give the name childhood. There certainly was a recognition that these were people who had to be protected from the adult world in particular ways. Yet the Mysore struggle drew in 60 to 100 children of different classes and castes who took up with deadly seriousness the powers of the alternative government, punishing the visiting Shanbag and Patel, and later compelling and humiliating the Amaldar and the sub-inspector, who were eventually killed. Now, if you look at the nature of this alternative power center that was set up, you can see, and this is again somewhere, some point at which it is quite distinct from the parallels elsewhere, that there was no shift in the local dominance of the Lingayats, merely a generational transfer of power, as if in anticipation of the nature of power that was to be in the independent nation state. Moreover, judging from both the demands that were put up on the walls of the temple and the kinds of actions that were taken against the emissaries of the state, most of the demands were anti-imperialist, but of a kind that would have had only limited appeal in a multi-class village. The call to attack government servants and even cut them to pieces were, as I have said, a very far cry from the cause of the man in whose name such actions were taken. There was the usual exhortation to promote communal amity and to wear khadi. But the don't pay a kandaya demand, which is don't pay revenue demand, could not have held the same meaning to the tenants of the big landlords, for whom a no rent demand would have been more appropriate, as it would to the landlords themselves. So the don't pay kandaya demand is making more sense to the landlords than to the tenants, since they were substantial payers of revenue. The richer landlords then had the most to lose by abstaining from the Quit India movement. And of course, there were some smaller peasants, such as those from the Vishwakarma community, who were also drawn into the struggle, and understandably so. The artisanal castes, this Devangas, Darjis, and so on and so forth, who were marginally drawn into the struggle. And for most people, the call to cut trees, stop paying tolls, and so on would have had a certain kind of appeal. But the majority of the active participants were from among the wealthier village elites. And this included the women. So unlike the other parallel governments at Talche, Satara, Mednipur, that is Tamluk Jatiya Sarkar, which lasted even up to 1944, there was not a single demand or action that attempted to alter the power structure so that the anti-landlord, anti-caste slogans and actions were non-existent. This was a feature of many of the actions that characterized the Quit India movement, since the colonial states' swift and brutal actions did not allow for the build up of a second wave of pitch struggle against local power structures as well. By the time of the release of most of the Congress members in 1943, the spirit of nationalism had been seriously dampened, and by 1945, such gains had not even been translated into representative assembly seats, with the Congress winning only 130 out of 310 seats. And in fact, the memoirs of people like Lingappa and H.S. Tarasamy and so on clearly indicate a certain kind of disappointment with the people of Mysore for having sort of not imbibed the lessons of nonviolence quite correctly. There is also a significant absence of the Muslims, who had been totally alienated from the Congress-led movement by this time, and this is better explained. As tenants and as intermediaries, they would have had no stakes in no revenue demand. We know certain tensions between, for instance, Patel Gurshantapa and his Muslim tenant, who was only able to pay half of his rent in 1942. But these tensions had more to do with the structure of the local economy. Both police and defense witnesses testified that there were no animosities between Hindus and Muslims in the area. Indeed, it was said quite clearly and by many witnesses that there is no ill will between Hindus and Muslims in Mysore. Less easily explained, at least locally, is the absence of the lower castes. Only one of the 50 accused was an Adi Karnataka, discharged for want of evidence. So there is this absence of lower castes who were certainly a presence in this village. After the fire of 1928, the reports had it that only the tiled roof houses were burned to the ground, and that the thatched and flimsy homes of the Adi Karnatakas and the Waddars miraculously escaped the fire. The second fire of nationalism seems to have given the low castes a go-by as well. They are not mentioned by the Congress narratives, defense witnesses, or the police witnesses as having participated in this cataclysmic event. There is, on the other hand, a hint of coercion on the part of the Upper Caste Shikaripur Congressites on the Kurubas of the area. So you get a very, very complex picture of how the social relations and economic structure of this village actually maps on to certain kinds of political allegiances or differs from these political allegiances. The cultural coordinates of village nationalism centered on the temple would certainly have been somewhat discouraging. The choice of the Veerabhadra temple as the site of this parallel government was far from neutral in a small face-to-face community such as Mysore, and despite its virulent anti-imperialism, could not have become the location for an articulation of more radical demands. I'm just going to read one little paragraph from the existing article in order to demonstrate this. A certain kind of religiosity that was like a patina that covered the nature of the protest in this region itself. As I have said in this article, Basanappa's control of the Mysore Congress was more or less complete. Lingappa, in his memoirs, describes the path taken by the daily Prabhat Feris thus. He says, after wending its way through the Harijan and other Keris, the procession reached the porch of the Sahukar mansion, where the Sahukar's first wife, Chandramma, performed Aarti and blessed the crowd, which then proceeded towards the main headquarters of the movement, namely the Veerabhadraswamy temple. A new sacred geography was thus traced by this procession, weaving the disparate elements of the village into a single fabric in the name of the nation. though there were no signs that the older social and political order had relinquished its hold on the village. And as I've said before, and I reassert, if anything, older elites anticipated the arrival of renewed political power in new and interesting ways. So clearly, these are not elements that are going to necessarily produce this kind of new unity, although this is the story that we get from all the accounts of the Isur episode itself, that it was extraordinarily united, and it was, singing the song of independence in one voice. Then there is, and here I come a bit more directly to what I said I would address in this talk, a certain question of gender. There is this troubling question of manliness. There was a frequent invocation of manliness in the discourse at Isur, and to some extent, this echoed Gandhi's own words when he said in 1942, and I quote, "In this struggle, every risk has to be run in order to cure ourselves of the biggest disease, a disease which has sapped our manhood and almost made us feel as if we must forever be slaves." This was translated in a pamphlet that circulated in Isur as, and I quote, "They say that you are cowards, that you are not manly, and that you are slaves. Our love of country and love of freedom, empty words which mean nothing to you. They say we sell our souls for wages and food, and that our men are mustachioed cowards and swine who die for pay and frightened ghosts or shadows of men. Do you not flare up when you hear all this?" This was followed, of course, by a rallying call being given to both men and women. And if I can just share a few other sentences from this part here, there was this constant reference to the beating of thighs as a way of actually establishing a certain kind of masculinity, which was given by Sahukars Baswanappa and Rudrappa, as well as several others, to emphasize their capacity to stand up to their opponents. Now, parallel to this was, of course, the participation of women themselves. So there is almost a nice, an interesting kind of mirroring of this demand for manliness, which takes the shape of describing women's participation as a failure of femininity. And of course, I need not say that this characterization of women's political participation is coming from the prosecuting judge. So we need to take that into account. Nevertheless, we do have records, Congress records, as well as police records, which testify to very large numbers of women, I have already mentioned this, participating in the 1930-1934 no-tax rebellion in the neighboring Bombay, Karnataka, particularly in Karwar and Ankola and so on and so forth. Krishnabai Panjekar, for instance, many women whose names are mentioned, Gaurama and so on. A very significant participation by these women, who are also people who, along with men, who established these Balak ashrams for those children whose parents had been taken to jail. So there is quite a, and there were also the women who had undertaken forms of fast as a form of protest against lands that had been recuperated by the state for the non-payment of dues and had been sold to other members of the communities. So there was a lot of very active participation by women in these movements at this time. But what we know in Isur is that in addition to this group of 60 to 100 children, for instance, there was a large proportion of girls amongst the children as well. And there were also 3 very active women who were convicted for life for their active role in the death of the 2 officials. The one woman, Halama, was the second wife of the Sahukar Baswanappa, a second and rather young wife. She showed an unusual ferocity in her attack on the Amaldar, the sub-inspector, and other members of this party. This caused the judge to comment about Halama, and I quote, "She has taken up a prominent part in attacking these people, and there is evidence to show that when the injured and the dying people wanted water, she refused to give water to them and offered them urine instead. She is a diabolical woman. She looks thin in build and dwarf in structure, but she is capable of all things attributed to her." And Riley really restored a certain notion of agency while retaining a conception of natural femininity when he noted, "There is nothing less brutal in what the women concerned did in this case. Except in their physical conformation, there appears to be nothing womanly in any of the accused concerned." So there is as it were, a very definite sort of ideal of womanhood that is being posed as that against which this political participation was rebelling. It is striking that two of the three women were related to the Sahukar. One is his second wife, Halama, and another, Siddhama, who was bounden to the Sahukar Baswanappa for arranging her mother's burial since she was excommunicated by the Sadhalingayats. Parvatama, who was the third woman, was the only agricultural laborer, as it were. And it is very interesting to know that, of course, she did not have even a single defense witness. So, she is in some ways paying the price for her marginality in the village twice over, because despite her political participation in this very important event, she receives no legal support at all. Ideals of femininity resonated in Lakshmi Devi Kadidal's pamphlet when she commemorated the release of the women from jail in 1947, when she said that women cannot be murderers. She said, "Can you imagine women being murderers? It's impossible." So, this is a completely false charge and they paid the price by being in jail for so long. Halama is supposed to have denied the Amaldar water, as I've said, and even suggested that they be given urine instead. And one of the policemen who actually survived that attack, Samiruddin Sharif, spoke of the rebellion as being led by children and women. So the principal actors in this case were not the men, but the children and women. There were about 10 or 15 women in the mob, he said, and none of them was crying. I mean, he thought it fit to mention this as a characteristic of their inhumanity. In fact, the tragedy of Mysore, as I think is now becoming obvious from whatever I have said, is that the larger money lenders and landlords such as Sahukar Baswanappa, Sahukar Rudrappa, Swami Shantavirappa, Patel Gurshantappa, the Amaldar Jayappa, and Angri Halappa remained outside the dragnet of the police, either by staying underground or through well-furnished alibis. The 5 martyrs were the dispensable heroes, largely small or medium peasants. So too were most of those who were imprisoned. The memory of Baswanappa, who died in hiding in the forest, is, however, described as a fate worse than hanging. And as I said, he has been in some ways recovered and restored in the memorial that is in Mysore. But Halama, who was related to the Sahukars by the accident of marriage, received not even a single defense witness from her own marital home. All those who testified on her behalf were from her natal village, Honnali. And not surprisingly, after her release, she went back to that village and lived the rest of her life there. So, it's a very kind of interesting moment that reveals to us not only the kinds of expectations of solidarity that are expected of women who are related to these men in particular kinds of ways, their own interest in participating in the nationalist movement, their own sudden discovery of the kinds of powers that they might have, which can be wielded, however brutally, in the space of this short period of so-called freedom. But we need to also speculate on the meaning of this violence, which was unprecedented and certainly unpremeditated. If the Quit India movement went against the grain of Gandhian nationalism while invoking his name, the people of Mysore appear to have diverged from even the so-called Karnataka model. So there was something that the police and the confidential branch and so on were identifying as the Karnataka model, which came from Bombay, Karnataka, a series of guerrilla actions which the people of Bombay, Karnataka had actually perfected. These were not, as the judgment would have it, people who were driven inexorably to crime. But one wonders whether the historians' accounts are necessarily truer. Sri Krishnan has suggested that the norms of mass activity were determined by nationalist discourse. And even Surinath Kamath has suggested that the fury of the people against the foreign government was demonstrated in their attack on these people. I would, however, like to suggest that the truth of the crowd action lies somewhere in between the purely criminal and the purely political act. There is no narrowly economic explanation of the motives for this act that can fill this enigmatic space of violence. But the surrogacy of these acts, in which young men and women, the wives and the tenants of the rich landlords, were goaded into and incited into action, cannot be understated. There was no vision of a world turned upside down, no promise of a more just social order in these actions. It is no surprise that the surrogates paid the heaviest price. The sharper vision of, so this is, these 5 people who are hanged are, of course, some of them are Lingayats, but many are non-Lingayat OBC castes as well. And here, what I would like to just read 1 or 2 paragraphs by way of conclusion to what I am suggesting here in this brief presentation is that the chief, it's no surprise, I've already said this, that the heaviest price was paid for by the surrogates. The chief instigators survived to live fuller lives. Rathavali Rudrappa and his son Shantavirappa emerged from the jungles in March 1943 to surrender before the police after the death of Baswanappa in hiding. Acquitted by the higher court in June 1943, Rudrappa did not serve his life sentence, while his son's life sentence was reduced to 4 years. And then you have the fact that the review judgment by Darcy Riley saved 6 from the gallows and reduced the sentences of 21 others while acquitting 1. But this did little to reduce the violence of the law, which sent the ironsmith K. Gurrappa, a Vishwabrahmin, to the gallows, a peasant K. Mallappa, goldsmith and peasant Surinarayanachar, the poor peasant Halappa, who was, incidentally, it is very, very likely that he was simply mistaken for Angadi Halappa and sent to jail, who was no active participant in the movement. It is believed that he paid with his life because of the accidental resemblance that his name bore to the absconding Angadi Halappa. And the peasant G. Shankrappa, Devanga, all of these men were sent to the gallows. If the people had satisfied themselves, said the judge, that is to say the sessions court judge, the special judge, Sundaraj Rao, said that if the people had satisfied themselves with following the Congress creed of nonviolence, this unfortunate incident would not have happened. So he is recognizing that somewhere the message of Gandhi has gone astray and that they have been encouraged to engage in an act of violence which is not proper to what the message of Congress political activity was, but that there should be a very severe punishment if only to prevent the recurrence of such crimes. And of course, as I said, Darcy Riley's review of this judgment did in fact exonerate one and reduce the sentence on many and saved a few from the gallows as well. But nevertheless, it has been, and rightly so, remembered as a very, very harsh kind of penalty that was imposed on the people of Mysore for this act of mob violence in which two members of the state were actually killed. But my interest in this was, as I said, to suggest neither that the nationalist narrative which proposes their heroism is entirely correct, nor the judicial narrative that proposes their criminality as the beginning and the end of this action as entirely correct, and that it is precisely because this incident, the kinds of actions in which these people participated, occupies in some ways this middle space between criminality and politics, that it becomes such an enigmatic and such an interesting example to think about. And I welcome comments on this. I feel it also has very useful kinds of lessons for our times. Thank you.
Thank you, Janaki. That was really quite engrossing. We are none of us, at least at CWDS, we are not, currently at least, the crop that we are now are not historians. So, listening to you was really quite fascinating. Let's have any comments from questions from the participants. Just unmute yourself, say who you are maybe, and just ask your question. Okay, let me just get started then. I was waiting for the women and children to arrive. And then you gave us manliness and masculinity. And then you gave us children briefly, and then you gave us some remarkable women. So I'm trying to still see what it is that then is the gender question. Is there a gender question? Are there several gender questions in this very intricate caste class account that you've actually given us? So what is it about, when those remarks are made about it's the children or it's the women who are doing the leading? What is your take on it? I mean, I felt that you were holding back by saying it's in between the criminal and the political. What is your sense of their relevance or their significance in this violent, event, of which there were plenty? My knowledge again of the Quit India movement is sparse, but there were, I imagine there were many more violent ones than the non-violent ones. Am I right about that?
Yes. Insofar as it actually attacked and destroyed a lot of government property, and also attacked actual people. There was a very serious event which happened elsewhere in Karnataka as well, but in that case, the police actually fired and killed several people in Shivaganga. So there were many such actions, and the parallel sarkars, the prati sarkars, which have been studied, were also rather violently repressed. But let's come to this question. It's an important one. What I'm perhaps suggesting is that in this moment, one thing that becomes clear is that the economic power of women in this village, existing economic power, is relatively low. So there is no particular link between their enthusiastic participation in these political events and their relatively low economic power, even if they were members of rich Lingayat families, as we've seen in the case of Halama. What it allows, therefore, is an expression of this freedom. So in some cases, it is an expression of freedom from certain kinds of restraints in which they are participating. And so this Prabhat Feri, the fact that they go around this village every morning and they are participating in the vision, however remote and however unfulfilled, of a possible freedom, is something that we cannot ignore. That's why I say there is something political too. So there is something changing in the nature of their political consciousness. I would not completely discount that. But the fact is that we hear only from a few dominant women, and people from the Congress who were sent to write about this were usually men. But that apart, they all acknowledge the role of women. They acknowledge the role of women in Bombay, Karnataka, as well. As I've said to you, they have even documented very carefully their names. So it's not like they've ignored them or anything like that. However, it's a bit of it's a bit like the story that has been told about the women who participate in the Telangana rebellion, which is that they had one kind of expectation, although we don't hear too much from these women themselves what their expectations were, and definitely those expectations were not fulfilled. But there is a brief moment when their participation is flashing up, as it were, in this moment of violence, which I mean, there is, I think we can safely conclude that there is no doubt there was almost a sort of kind of cathartic release of energies in this act of participating in this violence. Even if both the judge and the Congress people were not willing to concede that this was true of womanliness at this point. But yeah, so well, I suppose what I'm saying is that there is some kind of transformation happening politically, whether one likes to say that it is a long-lasting thing, or it's only a temporary, or a momentary, a spontaneous act, if you like. So it's a little different from the kind of training that women were receiving in the ways of nonviolence and civil disobedience elsewhere, in terms of more dignified picketing and, pulling in of clothes and changing to khadi and so on and so forth. It's quite different from that kind of activity as well.
Okay, thanks, Janaki. Others like to?
I think it generally raises the question of women's agency in these kinds of moments of violent action, and we have plenty of those examples in our present. So in some ways, we need to think about that as not being purely criminal, and perhaps, having some element of political changes that are being expressed in their participation in this particular way. I'm not saying there's a continuity, but I'm just saying that there's something for us to think about, perhaps.
What happened, we actually seen more recently, very much more actually closer to non-violent public protests in say Delhi and its environments. When you think of women being so visible in Shaheen Bagh, or you think of women being so visible in the farmer protests. We haven't talked enough about how central women were to the farmer protests. Have we had very violent examples in recent times?
I'm thinking more in terms of cases of mob violence. I saw, for instance, a recent TV report on the violence on a church in, I think it was Rohtak or Roorkee, where women certainly participated in large numbers, and who hotly denied that they were even capable of any such thing. And we are seeing those kinds of examples, I think, of women participating in riots, which again, I mean, the more common thing is to associate women with the more nonviolent forms of protest. And you're right, you've seen a very large and very heartening visibility of women in nonviolent protests and very creative forms of nonviolent protest in the last couple of years. And certainly women are out there in larger numbers than we would ever have imagined. Yeah. But I'm talking more about this kind of invitation to participate in group violence, which is something that would have been seen as not quite womanly, which is increasingly, I think, becoming visible in ways that we need to make sense of. What is it doing to the way women see themselves and their agency? So.
No other questions?
I think also what I've tried to do is what many other historians have suggested that we do, which is to sort of disturb the self-sufficiency of that judicial discourse and to be able to say things that are perhaps not intended to be said. So in that sense, it's an attempt to read a source that is produced for completely other kinds of purposes, to be able to extract. So we're really sort of extracting as much as one can from an archive that is actually more or less entirely devoted to proving criminality.
Yeah, right. Okay, yeah. Others, please join.
If people want to write their comments rather than say them, that's also.
Yes, there's the chat. Chat is available for anyone to use it.
Or maybe people just don't have questions.
Thinking over it still. Unmute yourself, Vasati, please.
Hi, Janaki.
Hi.
I found, to be very honest with you, I knew about both the Tamluk and the Maharashtra, the Patri Sarkar, but this is the first time I've had such a detailed thing about Mysore and this area, and that there was that there was such a similar kind of uprising, even though for a short time. I mean, it would be interesting to also look at whether there were any connections between these. That it should happen around that time between this. One has read different, what shall I say, accounts, both the Tamluk one as well as the Maharashtrian one. But I did not, to be very honest with you, my knowledge of Karnataka and Mysore history is not that up to the mark. But I must say, I don't know whether you're the first person writing about it.
No, I mentioned several who have written, but obviously not critically. Most of them have written rather glowing accounts of the heroic struggle of Mysore and so on. But you've asked a very important question. You're asking me were there ways in which the experiments that were happening in other regions at all percolating or of influencing what was happening in this? There is no evidence whatsoever that that was happening. What was the inspiration? There was a good deal of, I couldn't cover all this for the want of time, but maybe because we do have time, I could have read out those relevant parts. One of the most important influences at this time was Subhash Chandra Bose's speech. So that was constantly referred to. Gandhi, of course, Gandhi was the overwhelming presence in whose name all these actions were undertaken. And as I said, quite a lot of encouragement for establishing parallel government comes from the Bombay Karnataka activists. But it is not very clear whether they are already in the know of what is happening in the Satara and other kinds of Western Indian experiments. But there is, to whatever, as far as what I have read is concerned, no obvious link that seems to be established between these parallel kinds of experiments. Whether it was happening at some meta level amongst Congress leaders is something that you are now urging me to think about and look at. I haven't done that. I hadn't done that rather for this short piece. But my sense is that at least the Mysore material does not suggest that kind of exchange. So we do it's a very much in fact, even the kinds of things that are written about Isur post the event in terms of commemorating the the sacrifice and so on and so forth do not seem to betray any knowledge of these parallel Jati Sarkars. So it's interesting that scholarship also has remained confined to a rather small group of historians. I mean, the popular memory doesn't seem to have that cross-referencing that you think should be happening, especially for an all India organization like the Congress. So we don't have that kind of cross-referencing, that kind of inspiration. The inspirations are coming from Bose's Berlin address, the radio address, and also from Gandhi. So these are the two sort of nationalist sources that are constantly evoked in these slogans, in these communications, and so on and so forth.
I was wondering, I suppose we can have
We can't hear you, Vasanti.
I'm unmuted. There's something wrong.
Now you can.
Now we can hear you.
I said I suppose we will have, it would be nice if we could have a copy of this paper.
Sure. I will send, I can scan it and send it to Mary, and you could certainly have.
Please, I will do that.
Yeah. I think there is a question in the chat.
Yes, take a look at it. Dimple is asking you, how is the comparison with the Malabar Rebellion? A lot of coverage of it on it this year because it's the centenary year.
I assume that you're referring to the Malabar Rebellion, which is in the 20s. I mean, I suppose that's a completely different moment.
Yeah, different moment.
And also involving other kinds of issues. So I wouldn't be able to directly compare it to what is happening in Quit India, which is, as I said, the last big popular upsurge before independence. And the last big, in some ways, quite violent and quite strikingly violent upsurge. So
there's another question. Niyati Gangbar is asking, thank you for the engaging lecture, ma'am. What do we know about the motivation behind participation of children in the struggle?
That's an interesting question because these are all very difficult questions to answer given the nature of this archive. We certainly don't have access to what might have been the motivations. To some extent, you could say that they were, I mean, I'm tempted to think that there was a ludic element to it, that there was sort of a certain sense of joy of participating in something collective every day, the Prabhat fairies going around and so on and so forth. And there was also a sense of, a heady sense of power, which comes on the first day of the establishment of this independent Sarkar, where they put up the board and they say that nobody shall enter who doesn't subscribe to our independent Sarkar's dictates. And of course, this young boy is actually, and in fact, he's only 10 and his assistant is 12, but he is the grandson of the landlord. So, there is some sense in which there is a, as I said, and maybe it was missed because I said it in passing, it's almost like it is an anticipation of the power that is to come. I'm not saying that that's what motivates the children. I'm saying that children are participating in these actions because there is a certain joyousness to going around the village and singing and taking part with other children and so on and so forth. There is a certain headiness to the fact that you feel you can, because the entire village is behind you, that you can actually assert this kind of power in this way, in this form. Of actually insisting that they remove their topis, they stand on one leg, and they're making older people do this in a complete inversion of the hierarchies of generations, which are so strongly entrenched in village society. So this one can only speculate that this is something to which they are completely, they are really, there is a ludic kind of element, no doubt. And there is also this sense of an entitlement to exerting this kind of power, because that's the kind of background from which you come. It may not be accidental at all that both the boys who are the ones who are put in charge of the Sarkar are in fact the sons and grandsons of landlords. But I should add, and I'm sure this is something that everybody knows, that Quit India to a large extent consisted of student actions. And it ranged from student actions from people who resisted going to school to people who resisted and shut down colleges and so on. Yeah. So the student action was very, very large part of Quit India.
It's interesting that this, Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav kind of call that has been put out by, celebrating 75 years, at least the one that we have received from the Ministry of Education, is exhorting us to look for the lesser known personalities. That's the language that has been used, the unsung, the subaltern. This is the language actually that has been given to us. And I was very intrigued by that way of putting it. However, there are of course 100 ways of interpreting that. But for us at CWDS, it seemed like a way to actually bring in questions of gender, caste, and so on in different ways, since religion wasn't mentioned. In that sense, I think what you've done is very opposite to what at least the stated objectives have been.
Right. But I think that when one does start looking at the relatively anonymized kinds of figures,
yes,
people who have remained sort of at the margins of these kinds of accounts, then you will inevitably have to address and foreground the kinds of acts, the structures of silencing that are working in terms of caste structures, gender, of course, and even regional kinds of imbalances, which are very clear in some cases. But that, as I said, it is an opportunity. It's not perhaps doing. So there has been fairly, let me just say, because many of you will be unfamiliar with the Karnataka case, that Surinath Kamath, who was the director of the archives briefly in the 70s, undertook this exhaustive survey of what he calls what are called the freedom fighters, and brought out 3 volumes, Swatantra Sangrama Smritigalu, which have gone from taluk to taluk and from district to district to record these memoirs. Of course, I need not say that the women, despite their, clear, despite being clearly acknowledged as people who participated in both civil disobedience and in Quit India, are not very well represented. It's a very small handful of women which are included in this almost 800 memoirs. It's 3 very fat volumes. But they are very interesting volumes, and he has done a very good job also cross-referencing the kinds of activities to which they are referring and so on and so forth. They do not, however, include those voices of those who were children at the time when they were participating in these events. Not, at least these specific children have not been included, and as neither the specific people who were engaged in this Mysore Rebellion. So that is, there are a lot of people, like for instance, HS, the Doraiswamy and so on, who talk about the fact that they were young and they were therefore, in some educational institution or the other, but there's nothing that describes, to answer Niyati's question, what might have motivated children. There is a certain excitement about that moment and the promise of freedom that they all sort of testify to. But I think that formulaic way of thinking about that moment is also something that is suggested by the person who is collecting these memoirs. So it is not entirely an open-ended kind of collection of memoirs. So there's nothing which disturbs, as it were, this narrative of heroism and participation in something heroic, and the fact that you look back with satisfaction at the fact that you contributed your bit to this freedom struggle and so on and so forth. The discontents, if any, come out more in the kinds of conversations we've had with people who are there now, who say that, Yediyurappa had promised us Tattva-grama, but it didn't happen, and so on. So that kind of discontent and disgruntlement comes out in more contemporary conversations. But they are not certainly, so there is a certain formulaic way in which the nationalist memoir is constructed, and somebody will have to do the work on this to see, what are the ways in which it is set, so that you don't get any kind of voice that actually disturbs that. Of course, it was also, as you know, linked to the freedom fighters' pensions. So there is an element of the economic there as well, that the state has to recognize you as a freedom fighter in order to be able to give you the pension.
Any more comments or questions?
Just one. I just wanted, that volume that you referred to by Gyan Pandey.
Yeah.
That is 1988.
That's correct. And it's now available. You can read it online in the Pari website. The People's Archives, PARI, what does it stand for? The
People's Archives of Rural India.
Rural India. That it's there, so you can actually read that.
Oh, really?
Yes, you can read it online if you wish.
Yes.
So yeah, that's quite a useful resource, and that's a very good volume because it actually tells us, as I said, a totally different sort of picture of the normal accounts of Quit India that we have. Yeah. May I ask what other kinds of talks have been included in the series?
No, you're the first and we have to imagine the rest.
Okay.
In fact, your suggestions would be most welcome.
And they have to be on the freedom movement. No, well, you should get other regions.
I think we should, we should rethink the freedom movement as an ongoing movement that, if we are true to anything, then it doesn't end with independence. So, but that's left for others. I think next year we'll, this is for this month. So let's think, others will think about next month, I think. We've put in a lot of other kinds of requests with the Ministry of Education via the ISSR for different kinds of researches, different histories of disability that wouldn't only take, say, the global point of reference and so on. What would that be? We've tried to think of it, in fact, even outside the frame of nationalism, but nonetheless as being true to the thrust of this idea of alternate histories from the standard ones. But we have yet to hear from them in terms of where we may take it.
That's interesting. So, well, in that case, thank you very much, all the more, for making me give you this.
Yes, very much.
Oral talk. Yeah.
So thanks everyone for staying with us on a Friday evening, and thank you, Janaki, for being there.
Thanks, Janaki. I think I enjoyed it.
Yeah.
And I think, Mary, if I may suggest, you see, this whole thing of alternate histories of the freedom movement gives us enough room to be able to,
yes,
to look at, because what the ministry may have had in mind.
Your voice is going, Vasanthi, again. You have to, I think.
I don't know why unmuted. Anyway, I said that whatever they may have had in mind, I think there are many interesting articles and all that are coming out reflecting on the freedom on this whole period.
Yes.
And it would give us sufficient scope to be able to explore many alternative and subaltern histories in this period. And thank you, Janaki, for having opened my mind to this whole period in Mysore. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Janaki. Thanks all.
Yeah.
And yeah, watch out for the next edition. I can't predict what it will look like. Bye for now.